Once hailed as one of the world's best democracies, South Africa has now reached unprecedented levels of corruption, ranking it with other flawed democracies like Burkina Faso, Kosovo, and Vietnam. That's according to Transparency International's latest Corruption Perceptions Index, published this week. To put this in perspective, South Africa has fallen from 54th in 2010 during Jacob Zuma's presidency to 83rd in 2023 out of 180 countries. Professor Waldo Krugell, an economist at the Northwest University's campus, is here with me. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.
Absolutely. Now 54th in 2010, now 83rd in 2023 on the Corruption Perception Index. To what extent really has South Africa's reputation been damaged by this recent corruption ranking?
I think to a significant extent, but we should take a slightly more nuanced view of this index, and it helps to take a look at how it's compiled. So it takes data from a number of sources and puts together an index number where a larger number means less corrupt and a smaller number means more corrupt. Now, South Africa's score has fluctuated between 45 and 41 between 2010 and last year. And that means that the score itself hasn't changed that much, but the ranking has changed significantly, not because corruption in South Africa has gotten that much worse, but because other countries have been improving their standing in this ranking. Now, this doesn't excuse what's been going on, because corruption is bad for investment and bad for economic growth.
All right, I like what you're saying. You're saying that, in essence, it's not like South Africa is doing worse, but what happened is that a lot of other countries have improved. So what stopped South Africa from improving if other countries have improved?
I think South Africa really has a legacy of this time of state capture and syndicates really operating with economic crimes, and solving those problems are not straightforward. It takes a lot of resources in both the investigation and the prosecution of this, and we really haven't been making much headway in this regard. Some of this is also reflected in South Africa's grey listing early last year, where like an international institution like the FATF said, well, we haven't been making enough progress, and ended up on this grey list.
All right. So I think this particular one also, it's part of what you've said. You know, a few people think corruption under ex-president Jacob Zuma was more pronounced than during current President Cyril Ramaphosa. Now, how effective has the current government been in addressing corruption compared to the previous administration? What are the things we're seeing?
I think there are many new plans and processes in place, but they haven't been particularly effective. And I think it's really difficult to address perceptions of this. So even if you are making headway in formulating new legislation or putting new processes in place or allocating more money to specific functions like prosecution, it's difficult to change the perception that there's a lot of corruption and that corruption has been persistent in a way. So you're trying your best to fight this wave of corruption, but it's going to take much more time. So in the meantime, I think ordinary South Africans and respondents to surveys like this feels like not much has happened and the levels are still too high.
Well, so let's talk about the potential economic and maybe even the social consequences of unchecked corruption in South Africa.
Oh, they are significant. I think we've really seen the consequences of this in the deterioration of the capacity and the efficacy of the state-owned enterprises. They've really been victims of this time of state capture. And we also see it in the very low investor confidence and the very low investment rates that we're experiencing. And that translates into very low economic growth. The moment that your economy is not growing, that means you're not creating jobs. It also means that the fiscal position and government's debt to GDP is more precarious. All of this filters through to really the most vulnerable in society, who suffer from bad service delivery and slow economic growth at the same time. In that sense, corruption really is a disease that destroys society.
Absolutely. So how do we begin to change this perception? Because I mean, it's important that this perception is changed. You have said something about the fact that South Africa didn't get worse. Some countries got better, but not everybody will sit to analyze and know what happened, what went wrong, how that maybe Cyril Ramaphosa is doing better than Zuma and all of that. Perception is important. So how do we begin to change this perception? What are the things South Africa needs to begin to do?
I think it really is a struggle across many different fronts. You need to really trumpet the wins that you do get at that very high level of legislative changes and more resources going towards investigation and prosecution. That helps. It creates a positive feeling about the direction that things are going in. But then at a very low level, ordinary people, particularly business people, need to experience fewer cases of being asked for a bribe of some kind. And the only way that you can do that is to really crack down on these perpetrators. But that's quite difficult. Since the economy is experiencing really tough times, high interest rates, high price levels, I think there's a lot more small-scale corruption where officials and of many kinds ask for a little bribe somewhere along the side just to help them through their week or their month. They sort of think that's harmless, and they see the big perpetrators are not really being prosecuted. No one's ended up in jail following the Zondo Commission's recommendations. So you need to do the paperwork right, but then you also need to get to specific cases and start meting out the punishment for corruption.
Let's dig a little deeper into this particular report. Now, the top scorers in Africa are Seychelles, Cape Verde, and we have Botswana. They scored between 59 and 71%. And at rock bottom in Africa, we find Equatorial Guinea, South Sudan, and Somalia, with scores between 11 and 17. Now, what are the key differences between the top-ranked countries on the Corruption Perceptions Index and South Africa?
I think there are many differences in the fact that these top scorers are quite small economies. Compared to South Africa. Two of them are islands with very small open economies, and in the case of Botswana, it's very much a small economy with a very high, sort of strong resource base. So I think the South African situation is clearly more complicated, and we suffer these years of really organized state capture and corruption. But there's no denying these countries are doing things better. And a country like Botswana is allocating resources towards justice, prosecution, etc. And they've been doing better at this than South Africa. And we need to use this as an opportunity for some introspection. If we're falling relatively behind all our peer economies, that indicates how big the problem is.
Well, analysts like yourself have pointed to, government's poor performance in addressing the problem. You've talked about how that high-profile cases, are not followed through till the very end. So in a situation where the government is probably not willing or doesn't have the, political will to push through some of these cases, what options do people have? What options do South Africans have?
I think it's quite tricky for economists to speak about the politics of this. So whether it's a question of political will or a question of resources, I think it's probably a combination of both. On the resources side, it's clear that this problem is much bigger than the available resources. And during the so-called lost decade of the Zuma administration, there was really a hollowing out of many important institutions in terms of investigation and prosecution of corruption. And that capacity needs to be rebuilt over time with some money behind it. The fiscus is constrained at the moment, and getting back that human capital, literally the investigators, the prosecutors that need to do this job, is something that's going to take time.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Waldo Krugell, economist, Northwest University, for your time and for sharing your thoughts with us on Business Edge today.
Welcome.